Let me just remind you where you are or where you're supposed to be. In part one, we looked at the passage from a letter to the editor in a newspaper about flag burning, which is the thing that you're looking on your screen right now. And we took a look at what the person who was writing it said, and I asked you to sit down and actually do something of an evaluation, that is, explain what you understand the argument to be and whether it's a good argument or whether it's not a good argument. Now, you should have done that by now. If you haven't, sit down and stop this right now. Sit down and do it before we go on. Now, made a few comments about what the author was saying, what she was trying to do. But what we now want to do is take a look. I want to at least share with you some initial thoughts that I have about the letter and about the position she's taking on the Supreme Court's decision to say that burning a U.S. flag is it's an act of free speech. I mean, it does sound a little funny, right? That is, an action is actually free speech. But in a certain way, I don't know how you reacted, how you didn't react, but keep in mind when we look at all these things during the course of the semester, during our investigation, we want to really critically analyze everything. And let's understand what I mean by critically analyze. Critically, and don't think that it's just a question of being critical, being negative, but rather we don't want to just accept something because somebody said it, but rather we want to analyze it and see if that sounds like a good reason to accept what the person is saying. Now, in this case, the reaction that I have is, that at first glance, it does seem to look like it's a reasonable response to at least what some critics of the Supreme Court decision had to say, right? The person saying, that the critics are wrong about something or other, about their reaction to it. But in terms of what she criticizes, let's ask ourselves a few questions. Number one, what does what she has to say, whether they've protested when the rights of blacks were not being upheld, which happened for a long time, whether the right to vote, was being given to people. But when you think about the reason she cites, ask yourself the following question. With regard to any particular one, say, what does this have to do with the Supreme Court's decision? How is it relevant to the merits or the lack of merits of the Supreme Court's decision? Is this a good way to respond to opponents of the decision? Obviously, the author is upset about the response that the critics have given to the Supreme Court's decision. But the ultimate question we want to ask when we're looking at arguments is, has the author of the argument, has she cited reasons for her position? Now take a look for a second. Maybe you want to stop the recording right after this and take a look at what you've written. But have you addressed these kinds of questions? That is, the relevance of what the writer of our letter to the editor has to say about the Supreme Court's decision. Then is it really a good way to respond to people who are critical, who are opponents of the decision? So take a look. Did you respond in this way? And now let's ask ourselves a few more questions about it. And let me just make a comment. I mean, it looks like the letter really does not shed any light on on the issue of whether the Supreme Court's decision was a good one. That is, whether it was a correct one. Is burning a flag an act of speech that's protected by the Constitution? Ultimately, that is what the Supreme Court is supposed to be deciding. And if we see what happens in the letter, the author attacks the people who think that the court's decision was not a good one. That is, she attacks the person, not what they're saying in defense of their position, but rather attacking the person. Well, this sort of response to an argument is something that it's known as, and this is a very fancy Latin term. Notice I said before that it's a comment about the person. It's an argument against the person. It's something called an ad hominem argument. And typically, or perhaps atypically, not typically, people who are good at analyzing and evaluating arguments don't think that this is a reasonable way to judge whether an argument's a good one or a bad one. That is, making comments, true or false, about the person given the argument really doesn't weigh in on on the decision as to whether the person is right about the position and is giving good reasons for it. She doesn't really reply to the reasons that that is the critics, have for supporting their position. And it seems that's really what we should be looking to. What are the reasons that they cite, good reasons for thinking that the Supreme Court made a serious mistake? She responds emotionally to the conclusion of the argument rather than providing a reasoned response to the argument. So from this perspective, it looks like she's not shedding a whole lot of light. The argument that she's presenting doesn't shed a whole lot of light on the issue. And so from that perspective, the argument seems to be lacking something. Now, you don't have to agree with my assessment of the argument, but we're trying to get a little bit of a better handle, a better understanding of how to go about and reasonably assess the merits or the demerits of an argument.